Okay, hello. Um, so first of all, I wanted to just mention the reading from Thomas Aquinas for next time. It's about angels. Um, and I mean, it's there because as I hope you'll see, Leibniz's theory of monads is based on Thomas Aquinas's theory of angels. Um, um, All right, but for now, so I'm going to talk about the beginning of the monadology. Um, Again, as I said last time, monadology was not, I mean, it's not clear that Leibniz, actually, it's probably pretty clear that Leibniz didn't intend to publish it. Um, uh, but he didn't really write, and as they say in their note at the beginning, like it's really important to remember that monadology was not intended as an introduction to Leibniz's philosophy. I mean, I guess that's true, but the problem is he didn't really write anything that was intended as an introduction to his philosophy, right? I mean, this is what we've got. So, and it does, I think, hit almost everything important. Um, um, So even though, the kind of tradition of using this to introduce Leibniz's system is questionable, I think there's like good reasons for it, and there's not a lot of alternatives. So I'm going to use it without further apology. So, all right. So what is a monad? This graph here. I mean, this word, this is basically the Greek word for unit. Why exactly Leibniz chose it, I'm not sure, except that possibly because of what Aristotle says when he defines. And so, by the way, Leibniz, I mean, uh, Spinoza says somewhere when it's, although the context makes it not trustworthy, but as you might expect from Spinoza, but Spinoza, when he, in the theological political treatise, after he gets through discussing the authorship of all the Old Testament books and saying how none of them were written by who you think they were written by, and they were written much later, and they were composed of different pieces of whatever, he says, and I'm not going to go through a similar exercise for the New Testament because other people have already done it well. And anyway, my Greek is not good enough. So, I mean, presumably, like that's an excuse for getting out of doing the same thing with the New Testament books. But in any case, I, I, I take it from that he knew some Greek, but he wasn't like really comfortable with it, probably. Leibniz is, and Descartes, I don't know if I ever seen him use Greek. I think he must have known something about it. But anyway, Leibniz knows Greek pretty well. So, like, I mean, he reads Aristotle in Greek, not in Latin. So, and it's Aristotle at some point. Well, I know exactly what point, but anyway, when he's discussing the different kinds of quantity, he like says, a point is a quantity that's not divisible in any dimension and has a position. Whereas a monad, that is a unit, is quantity that's not divisible in any direction and doesn't have a position. Now, I mean, I think when Aristotle says that, he's like distinguishing between arithmetic and geometry, basically, right? So, like unit means what we usually mean by unit, but but Leibniz maybe is, I mean, because what he calls a monad is an indivisible kind of unit out of which everything is made, but it doesn't have a position. So I think maybe that's why he chose the word. If not, I'm not sure why. Um, so what is a monad? Well, a monad is a simple substance. Um, right? That's basically the first thing he says. Um, this is section 1. The monad, which we shall discuss here, is nothing but a simple substance that enters into composites. Simple, that is, without parts. So everything that's not a simple substance, uh, well, everything that's not a simple substance is a composite, right? In a strong sense of thing. I mean, there are modes of substances and whatever. I'll talk about what, you know, Leibniz thinks about that. But when you're talking about the kind of things there are in the world, things that could exist on their own account, et cetera, right? Like all the things that we've been hearing about substance the whole time. So they're all either monads or they're made out of monads. Um, right? And he says that, that's section 2. And there must be simple substances since there are composites, for the composite is nothing more than a collection or aggregate of simples. So that means these composites mean these composites are they're aggregates. Um, right, an aggregate means that you just clump some stuff together. It doesn't have its own essence or something like that. So maybe more strictly speaking, everything is a monad. But there are composites. That is somehow like out of these simple substances, you can make something else. Um, Moreover, a monad is a kind of immaterial substance, or at least maybe I should say incorporeal substance. Right? A monad is not a body. A monad is kind of like a mind. I mean, you know, we're going to talk about the different degrees of monads and the ones that are actually minds and the ones that are kind of like minds, right? But it's a monad is much more like a mind than it is like a body. Um, After all, it doesn't have parts. It's not divisible into parts. That tells you right away that it's not a body. Um, so that means like you put the two things together, everything is made, it either is an incorporeal substance, um, or is made out of incorporeal substances. Right. So that's why I said, or that's like a first way of seeing why I said last time that even though Leibniz often talks, including in the Monadology, as if there were bodies, in some strict sense, there are no bodies. Right? A body is an extended substance, and there are no extended substances. Because every substance, every simple substance is incorporeal. And when you put them together, you don't get a body. um, by putting together incorporeal things. Um, so everything is made out of angels, basically. I mean, again, we'll see next time and how literally that's true. It's not completely, they aren't completely like Thomistic angels, but they're very, very close to being like Thomistic angels. Everything is made out of angels. Everything is made out of an infinite number of angels. That's Leibniz's theory. So, of course, it seems like there are bodies. Um, so how can that be? Um, and um, I mean, I'll say more on that later and even more about that next time about like where bodies or apparent bodies fit in here. Um, I mean, you can tell already when he says, so, I mean, it's like a mind. But Leibniz says rather than call them all minds, to keep clear in what sense they're like minds, but not, they're not all fully minds. They're not all fully thinking things. He says, I prefer as a general term for what they are, entelechy. Did I talk about the word entelechy before in this class? No? Okay. So entelechy, I mean, entelechy is intellect, Inteletheia, I guess, is the Greek word. Um, it's not super clear what this word means in Greek, but what is super clear is that Aristotle uses it in his definition of the soul in the De Anima. And his definition of a soul is that it's the first entelechy of a living organized body. That's the definition of soul in Aristotle. So, I mean, by choosing this term entelechy, Leibniz is saying that, yeah, in a sense, a monad has a body. And moreover, it's an organized body. Um, and the only question is, so to speak, what kind of soul is this, or how much of a soul is it? I mean, Aristotle himself says that humans have souls, animals have souls, and plants have souls, right? So you're already getting to a kind of soul or entelechy that's not exactly a mind. At least, I mean, I don't know. Some people now say that plants have minds, whatever, but Aristotle doesn't think that. So um, I don't think I really think that either. But in any case, so right, so it's not exact. It doesn't really have a mind, but it has an organized body, and it has an entelechy. I mean, so I said it's not super clear what it means, but at least um, um, like one etymology of it, sort of, and like whether it's true or not, it's how a lot of people understood it. That it has something to do with perfection. So it's like the perfection or actuality. Um, it's the principle that makes the organized body what it is, or something like that. So even if you only have nutrition, and you don't have sensation and rationality, it's still enough to have an entelechy. Um, so that's what he's getting at here. So that's again a way of saying that even though in a sense there are no bodies in this picture, it's important to Leibniz that in another way, and in a way that has nothing false in it, right? Like as we saw him saying about Aristotle last time, you can describe his picture as containing bodies, and like I said, he often talks that way himself. Um, okay, I mean, why does he want to say this? Um, I mean, there's a lot of different things between it. Behind it. He's trying to solve a lot of different problems at the same time. I mean, one problem he's trying to solve is about the composition of the continuum, right? So it's like a mathematical slash metaphysical question about how there can be lines, for example, right? Because if you think a line is made out of points, well, a point has zero extension. And if you add another point to it, that other point also has zero extension. Zero plus zero is zero. So no matter how many points you add, you don't get a line. Um, so, and yet, isn't it true in some sense that a line is like has points on it everywhere? How can it be composed out of points? So, I mean, that's the problem that he's getting at in that that he I mean that's the justification that he gives here explicitly when he says um, that there must be simple substances since there are composites. And yet those simple substances can't themselves be um, they can't be themselves be extended. If we assume the composite is extended, the simple parts of it can't be extended because then they're not simple. Um, but they can't be parts of zero extension of the line because you can't add those up together and get a line. So we need to compose it out of immaterial parts, out of unextended, non-extended parts, not not just parts that are um, not parts of extension that aren't yet extended, so to speak, but parts that don't have anything to do with extension at all. That is, something that's indivisible that doesn't have a position, a monad. Right. So that's one thing he's doing with this. Um, Another thing, he's also trying to solve other problems about body or extension. Well, I guess about body in particular, right? Like as I think I already mentioned, he's worrying about this issue with Descartes about what this line around the body is, and how, right? If that is that if there's nothing in body but body, um, then there's no way of individuating them. And there's no possibility of motion or change because things will be the same after the motion as they were before. And that's something he actually says. Um, this is section 9 of the Monadology. No, actually, this is section 8. If simple substances did not differ at all in their qualities, there would be no way of perceiving any change in things, since what there is in a composite can only come from its simple ingredients. And if monads had no qualities, they would be indiscernible from one another, since they do not differ in quantity. As a result, assuming a plenum, right, a plenum is the opposite of a vacuum, meaning it's full. Assuming a plenum, each place would always receive only the equivalent of what it already had, and one state of things would be indistinguishable from another. Right? So, introducing these monads and also introducing the kind of qualities that make them different from each other is going to be a way of, and then saying that somehow bodies are composed out of them is going to be a way of solving this problem. Now, it's not going to be true that when this body moves into this space, nothing has changed. Because the qualities of, I mean, I'm drawing it this way, but as we'll see, this is actually really misleading. But the qualities of the monads that are in this body are different from the qualities of the monads that were in this body. And so when this body moves into this space and this body moves out, something changes. And remember, like, this is like Descartes needed this because what Descartes said the difference between one body and another one is states of motion. Spinoza also said this, right? Different modes differ in their in motion and rest. Um, so, but motion doesn't make sense unless there's something there besides extension, is what Leibniz is saying. Um, um, he's also trying to solve the mind-body problem, which again, we saw Descartes had terrible problems with. Um, like the the way it's going to be possible to say that a monad has a body is going to be such that, well, from some point of view, there'll be no problem at all. From another point of view, there is going to be a problem, but it's the perfection of the divine will solve the problem. That is God not being a deceiver. Um, so in that sense, it's going to be very much like Spinoza's solution, right? That is, remember, Spinoza, the problem in Descartes was we can't explain how a mind and a body can act on each other. No, I never got a chance to talk about that. I hope you read the part where Spinoza makes fun of it. Like he says, how hard can the mind push? Right? Like how strong is it? How much body does it take to resist it? And the implication being, of course, that Descartes can't make any sense of that. So Leibniz is going to agree with Spinoza, minds and bodies don't act on each other. Um, but um, uh, nevertheless, there's um, um, we can be sure that they move parallel to each other. And yet, he's going to try to do this in a way that gets away from Spinoza. So that is, he, number one, doesn't want to say that there's nothing but God, that there's only one substance and it's the infinite substance. He wants to bring finite substances back. And he wants to get away from Spinoza's conclusion that there's no freedom, that finite things have no freedom because they're constrained in everything they do, and that although God is absolutely free, God doesn't have a free will, right? So God's freedom is just God's infinite power, according to Spinoza. That's all it is. So Leibniz wants to get away from that and get back to the idea that there's a distinction between the divine intellect and the divine will. The divine intellect understands what's absolutely necessary, but the divine will chooses what's good. Um, so I think I've listed about 4 motivations now. And then another motivation is um, that he wants to show that there's some truth in a whole bunch of different people. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, also, Plotinus, all kinds of, right? So, like, his system is also supposed to provide an interpretation for what's right in all these other systems. Um, so, I mean, I'm going to remark on all of these as they come up as we go along today, but for the most part today, I'm just going to be trying to explain the details of the system as it's set out in the monadology without going too much into the question of why someone would say this. Right? Does it, because like the more you see what he's saying, the more urgent the question becomes, but why should I believe that? Why would someone claim that? Um, Okay, so there are questions about any of that before I go on? Yes. So, I mean, the key move again, and it's the like, it's the break from Spinoza. Um, I was going to talk about this later, but maybe I should talk about it now since you're asking. Yeah, I mean, like the fundamental adjustment that makes everything work is to say that not everything possible that is conceived, not everything conceivable is actual. Um, there are two different kinds of truth, therefore. There are truths of fact versus truths of reasoning. This is discussed in section 33. Um, there are two kinds of truth, those of reasoning and those of fact. The truths of reasoning are necessary and their opposite is impossible. The truths of fact are contingent and their opposite is possible. So, um, so in connection with divine freedom, the way that's going to come in is um, that uh, um, the divine intellect understands everything that's possible. But not all of that stuff is jointly possible. Again, right? That is not everything possible is actual, and not everything possible can be actual together. Does he really think that actually? Maybe it's just that it wouldn't be good if it was all actual together. In any case, the divine intellect understands everything that's possible. Um, and like what goes against that is impossible, that is contradictory. Um, the divine will chooses out of that the best. So, so it's free because it was possible, that is not contradictory for it to choose something else. Right? That is, there's no contradiction in God making a less good world. It's within the divine power to do that. And that's the sense in which God decided to create the best world. Even though, in another sense, no other choice is possible, I think. I mean, in a really strong sense that there's no other principle. There has to be what truths of fact need is a sufficient reason. And for there to be a sufficient reason for something, it has to be unique, you know. And the only, I think it's just as Descartes says, there's one best way of doing something, there's many bad ways of doing it. So, um, the like a self-determining will has to choose the best. Um, but it's still possible for it to do something else in the sense of absolute possibility that it's not contradictory. Does that answer what you're asking or no? Well, no, I mean, it depends what you mean by had to, because yeah, it wouldn't be self-contradictory for God to create nothing, right? It would be um God wouldn't create nothing because it's better to create something, right? But God could have created nothing. Yeah, that's um um Yeah, so it was a decision to create. And, I think um, I'm still not really sure after reading Theodicy and other things, I'm not sure if Leibniz really thought that creation in time was made sense or not. But um, I mean, it seems not because it seems like that would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Why at this time, not at some other time? But he often talks as if he does believe in it. So I don't know. Yeah, were you asking a question?
No, I understand Spinoza's perspective, and I'm wondering what Leibniz that, like, because yeah, I don't think it's one of them.
Yeah, I mean, so Spinoza doesn't make it as like Spinoza thinks everything possible is actual, and doesn't make any distinction between intellect and will. And I mean, as usual, maybe it's a little hard to say which of these things comes first, but at least everything goes together on one side and the other, right? So, it was like from Spinoza's point of view, yeah, there was no choice. Um, there's no choice to be made. The infinitely powerful thing necessarily creates everything. I mean, of course, what it creates is just itself. But it definitely doesn't do it in time, right? It definitely wasn't a time before Spinoza's God created all the modes of extension or something like that. But um, but eternally speaking, it had to create everything. Whereas Leibniz's God did not have to, was not constrained by, was not absolutely impossible for God to create nothing. All right. I mean, these same things again are then are going to be used. Well, I mean, like um, they're going to be used first of all to explain how finite substance is possible and how finite substances can be free, even though they're not self-caused. Um, but maybe I'll get back to that because I want to go on with the more elementary stuff yet. So, um, okay, so here's some characteristics of monads. And um, in in the monadology, it's these are all derived from the fact that monads are simple and therefore do not have extension. And therefore, well, so the first one is in section 3 that monads are indivisible. And actually, the reason I said this is how they're proved in the monadology is because Spinoza proves all these things about substances on seemingly quite different grounds. And Spinoza ends up there's only one of them anyway, right? But like so, I mean, one question in my mind, and I'm not sure exactly what to say about this, to tell you the truth, but that like does Leibniz also agree with Spinoza's proofs of these things for a substance in general? So in any case, they're indivisible. Um, this is, I mean, notice, I think I might have mentioned this before, that even according to Aristotelians, an organized body like an animal, well, it's a little bit different from plants, which is one reason plants are living. But an organized body like an animal is in a sense indivisible. I mean, of course, if this is Bucephalus, you can cut Bucephalus into two pieces. But the two pieces are not horses. So that is, Bucephalus is formally indivisible, or is a formal atom. As I think I mentioned before, indivisible, individual, I mean, you can see that these are practically the same word, right? Indivisible and individual, but also atom. These are all the same Greek word, atomos. Right? So, like, the reason actually we call Bucephalus an individual is that Bucephalus is a formal atom. And that's what Leibniz says about the monads. They're formal atoms. That is, I mean, it will turn out that a monad, in a sense, has a body, but its body is an organized body, and therefore its body, qua body of that monad, is indivisible. Just like Bucephalus in an Aristotelian picture, or actually, I mean, in any picture. Everyone agrees that horses can't be cut apart at pouch to horses. But don't try this at home. All right. It won't work. um, so, another thing he shows about them is that each has a unique quality. Now, quality here is not being used in the sense of the accident of quality, but it is being used in the sense, remember that, and this was one of the puzzles that people were worrying over when they were talking about the categorical status of the differentiae. Aristotle says, in one sense, quality means the differentia of substance. And he also said something like the differentia is a certain how is it, which in Greek, right, well, qualitas means howness. And it's like the translation of the Greek word pleiotes, which also means howness, right? So it's like a certain how is a certain quality. So each has a unique quality, that is, each is specifically different from all the others, is what that means. That is, no two monads differ solo numero, only numerically, the way Socrates and Plato were supposed to. I think I already talked about this last time, but right, Socrates and Plato are supposed to be only numerically different, meaning they're essentially the same. They have the same essence. So remember, one of the first things Spinoza proved is that there can't be two substances of the same attribute. So that this situation is impossible. And Leibniz agrees. Right? So each monad has its own unique quality. So, I mean, what this means for monads as finite substances, though, is that each one of them has an infinitely complicated definition, so to speak, right? Because there's infinitely many monads, and each one has to have its own unique definition, right? A definition that differentiates it from every other monad among the infinitely many monads. So the definitions have to be infinitely complicated. So like in that way, they're like one of Spinoza's finite modes, right? Remember, a finite mode, according to Spinoza, like the reason we don't know it clearly and distinctly. And this is going to carry over to Leibniz in a way. And this is actually going to be part of the explanation of why there seem to be bodies. But, so according to Spinoza, the reason we don't know any finite mode clearly and distinctly is because to know which mode it is, you have to know all the modes that it depends on, like its causes going back ad infinitum. And this is both a kind of demonstration of it regarded as a judgment, but it's also a definition of it regarded as an idea. Or I guess as the object of an idea, if we're talking about modes of extension. I don't know if this was ever clear to people. Someone want to ask a question about this? No? All right. So anyway, so that is, according to Spinoza, any finite mode has an infinitely complicated definition. So according to Leibniz, every substance has an infinitely complicated definition. But you can see, on the other hand, how they're going to have to disagree with each other because of the difference between mode and substance, right? So like according to Spinoza, the infinitely complicated definition of this mode is composed of external relations to other modes. Right? So it's composed of its relations to these infinitely many other modes. And they're external relations in the sense that like just from this mode by itself, you can't derive these other modes that are its cause. They're not like real I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the distinction between external and internal relations, and it's probably not worth getting into for these purposes. But in some ways they're not like what people usually mean by external relations, but in an important way they are. So Leibniz says monads have an infinitely complicated definition, but this has to be an infinite list of internal determinations of the monad itself, because the monad is a substance and it has to be conceivable by itself. Okay, here's another characteristic. And by the way, so how does Leibniz argue for this? I mean, I said the monadology doesn't really is kind of a list of propositions more than arguments, but the truth is there are actually, maybe I shouldn't say that. There are actually a lot of arguments in here. They're just very short. They're just very compressed, So like what's the demonstration of this? I mean, his first demonstration of it is again going back to issues about bodies. And that's the thing I read before about how if there weren't something different about the different monads, there couldn't be any change and so forth. But then he says, this is section 9, it is also necessary that each monad be different from each other, for there are never two beings in nature that are perfectly alike, two beings in which it is not possible to discover an internal difference, that is, one founded on an intrinsic denomination. An intrinsic denomination is something that you call something because of what it's like, as opposed to an extrinsic denomination, which is something you call something because of its relation to something else, right? So, like father is an extrinsic denomination, right? Like if you ask, what is this? And someone says, it's a father, that's an extrinsic denomination. It's due to a relation to something else. So Leibniz is saying, everything must differ in a way that's based on its intrinsic denominations. And this is the famous principle of identity of indiscernibles. I'm sure everybody this lesson. work. I've already mentioned a couple of Leibniz's famous principles. One is the principle of sufficient reason. If anything is contingent, that is, it could be this way or it could be some other way, there must be a reason why it's actually this way. That's basically the principle of sufficient reason. Identity of indiscernibles, what he just said. There can't be in nature two things that that don't differ in their intrinsic denominations, in their intrinsic properties. And although he doesn't argue for it right here, like you can kind of see why someone would say this, because like I think I also mentioned this last time, that if I say these two things are different to each other, different from each other, thing one and thing two, but they don't actually have one and two written on them. They're indiscernible. That is, everything you can tell just from considering this thing by itself is exactly the same as this one. So now I want to say, but they're not the same. And how can you tell? Because this one is to the right. Thing two is to the right of thing one. But what is to the right of thing one? But like, don't I actually have to already know an intrinsic difference before I can say that? That's the general line of thinking that leads you in this direction. Right, so, and therefore, since there can't ever be indiscernible things, no monads can be indiscernible, and that's why each one has to have a unique internal description, and that's its unique quality. Okay, another characteristic is that monad is not acted on by any external, and then I'm going to put here in parentheses, finite cause. That is, monads are acted on by God in a certain way. It's actually a very limited way, as I'll explain. The monads are acted on by God, but other than that, they're not acted on by any external cause. Now, I mean, Leibniz proves this based on the fact that they're not composite. This is section 7. There's also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature. That's some other creature is where he's putting that finite, right? Creature means as opposed to God. Right? Creature is from create, it means something was created. Right. So there is also no way of explaining how a monad can be altered or changed internally by some other creature, since one cannot transpose anything in it, nor can one conceive of any internal motion that can be excited, directed, augmented, or diminished within it, as can be done in composites, where it can be changed among the parts. I mean, that proof is a little hard to understand because I mean, it's true that if all you have is bodies like Descartes or Spinoza, and you want to talk about a body changing, the only way it can change is to somehow rearrange its parts. Right? Like replace some of them, take some off, move them around, change the way they're moving, something like that, right? I mean, the reason that's the only way it can change is because body itself is the same everywhere. But since we've now brought in the whole point of monads, they differ from each other in some intrinsic way. Like, it seems like, how do we know something can't cause that to change? So, I mean, I think Leibniz has something to say about that, but it's, he hasn't filled in the details. Um, I mean, the it's easier though to understand Spinoza's proof at this point. And maybe this is really what Leibniz has to say about that. But then the thing about it not being composite is not really relevant even. I don't know. Anyway, remember the way Spinoza proves that a substance can't be acted on by another substance is because that is by a substance of a different species is basically that a substance can be conceived only through itself, whereas an effect has to be conceived through its cause. So that still remains true of Leibniz's substances. Even though he doesn't give that proof here, I think that proof still holds for Leibniz's substances. The question is, again, do all of Spinoza's proofs hold for Leibniz's substances? Maybe. Even though he doesn't give those proofs here. All right, so anyway, this is an important characteristic of a monad. Now, uh, um, you might ask, like, what justifies this exception? Why can God act on a finite substance? Isn't there going to be the same problem? They don't have anything in common. They're different substances. One can be conceived without the other. Therefore, they can't act on each other. So the answer is that Leibniz has brought back eminent being, right? And remember, this was the answer in Descartes. Like, how is it that God can, right? As opposed to mind and body, which was hard to understand, for Descartes, like, it's easy to understand how God can act on us because God contains the same perfections we do in an eminent sense. And as I pointed out in Spinoza, one of the first surprises in the ethics is when you realize he doesn't believe in that anymore, right? So when he says that two substances that have nothing in common one can't be a cause of the being or action of the other, he means he's not making an exception for, oh, but it can have it in an eminent sense. But Leibniz, on the other hand, is, right? So this is section 38 of the Monadology. And that is why the ultimate reason of things must be in a necessary substance in which the diversity of changes is only eminent as in its source. This is what we call God. Right? So God contains all the perfections that all the monads have, right? Like all the qualities that all the monads have. But whereas in the monads, they're dispersed, they're all different from each other. In God, they're present in an eminent sense in which they're all the same. And remember, that's the exact pattern of traditional pattern of eminent being, right? Like, even in like a simple example of a Platonic form of horse, let's say. Like, this is the horses. And then there's horse. Like with a capital H. The capital letters hadn't been invented yet, but Plato uses and Platonists use other devices to mark this out. So anyway, so like this is the cause, the paradigmatic cause of all these horses down here. It, you know, um, it's in some number one is in some way totally unlike a horse. it's unchanging, incorporeal, right? Um, not perceptible by the senses, right? Like it's very different from a horse, but it actually contains everything about a horse, only in a higher sense, right? And moreover, whereas in what we call horses that are actually only the images of the horse, right? All these things are dispersed. In the horse itself, they're all unified, simple. Um, um, so that section 38 of the Monadology is actually, that's one place where Leibniz is being completely traditional. Um, okay, so another characteristic of monads, um, I guess this is the last one I'm gonna list, right? Well, it's not true. Yeah, no, this is the last one I'm gonna list right now. So monad can't, then in parentheses, naturally begin or end. Um, I mean, uh, so right, this is sections 4 through 6 of the Monadology. There is also no dissolution to fear, and there is no conceivable way in which a simple substance can perish naturally. So again, by saying dissolution, he's proving this just using the fact that the monad is simple or incorporeal, right? He's saying the way something can naturally cease to exist is to come apart. And if something doesn't have parts, there's no dissolution to fear. For the same reason, there is no conceivable way a simple substance can begin naturally, since it cannot be formed by composition, right? So again, he's saying like the way something can naturally begin is by its pre-existing parts coming together to make it. And since the monad doesn't have parts, that can't happen. And then section 6 says, and this is the reason for putting naturally in parentheses, thus one can say that monads can only begin or end all at once. That is, they can only begin by creation and end by annihilation, whereas composites begin or end through their parts. Right? So the monad can't naturally begin or pass out of existence, but it can be created or annihilated by God. Does God actually do that? Um, so I said about creation, it's not clear to me, and about annihilation, I'd say I'm pretty sure Leibniz thinks that God never actually annihilates monads. Um, um, it's logically possible for God to annihilate monads. There's no impossibility in it. It's within divine power, but God wouldn't choose to do it because it would make the universe worse if things were annihilated. I think. I don't know any place where Leibniz says that. I mean, he does pretty much say that about rational monads, that is, monads that are literally minds. Not sure he says that anyway clearly about all monads, that although they could be annihilated, they won't be. Um, um, but again, so like Leibniz proves that using these things about bodies, but uh, remember, in effect, Spinoza also proves this. So, I mean, I don't think he ever proves this about the divine substance, because it wouldn't make sense, right? Like you can't think about it in time at all. It's eternal. And remember, for Spinoza, eternal doesn't mean exists at every time. It means like time doesn't apply to it. And by the way, Spinoza's not the only person who says that about eternity. That's pretty common, actually. So, but Spinoza does in effect prove this about substances in general, because he proves that nothing can be destroyed except by an external cause. Remember that? That's in part 3, I think, of the Ethics. Or is it in part 2? I guess it's in the end of part 2. No, it's where all the stuff about Nisus or Cleontis. No, I guess it's the beginning of part 3. Anyway, wherever it is, Spinoza proves that something can't be destroyed except by an external cause, right? Because the conditions on which it can't exist are not involved in its essence, and so it can't be the cause of its own destruction. Well, so if you add in that the thing is itself a substance and therefore can't be acted on by any external cause, then any finite external cause, then you have that it can't naturally be destroyed. Because it can't destroy itself, and no external cause except God can act on it. So in other words, this is what Spinoza would say about finite substances if Spinoza believed in finite substances. So, as I said last time already, when you add all this up, it starts to sound like Leibniz's monads, so they're clearly not at all like Spinoza's finite modes, either finite minds or even less like finite bodies. But they are pretty similar to Spinoza's attributes. Especially when you add in that Leibniz says that each one of them expresses the entire divine essence. And given that there's also a kind of parallelism between them, it sounds even more like Spinoza's modes. Well, he's got rid of that weird problem about the asymmetry between the attribute of thought and other attributes, right? Because they're all attributes of thought now. So remember the question I asked about Spinoza, we talked about Proposition 7 of part 2, and he said that the relationship between a mind and a body, this is the attribute of thought, and this is the attribute of extension. The relationship between a mind and a body is reference. The mind, like this body is the object of the idea that is this mind. This mind refers to it in the way an idea refers to its object. But then he also said that in another way, these are actually the same thing looked at from 2 points of view. I was in the scholarly to Proposition 7 of part 2, and I pointed out that that was weird because this relationship is not symmetrical, right? Even though an idea has an object, for example, it might be a body. A body doesn't have a mind as its object. Bodies don't have objects. Ideas have objects. So, as I said, like Leibniz's monads solve that problem because they're all modes of thought, or they're all attributes of thought. And there is no attribute of extension. um, so, but I mean, leaving that important difference aside, it starts to look even more like maybe Leibniz really agrees with Spinoza, right? This is similar to, there's infinite attributes, well, there's infinite monads, and they all represent each other. And they all have certain states that correspond to the states of the other monads. Um, how is this different from Spinoza? And remember, an attribute, like because it expresses the divine essence, in Spinoza, an attribute has all of these characteristics. However, it actually is very different, and the difference is the same one I already mentioned, basically, namely that not all possible monads are actual. Yeah.
Would Spinoza say that attributes are simple?
Well, they're not divisible, right? Remember that whole proof he had to go through, that whole argument he had to go through, because people said extension couldn't be an attribute of God because anything extended is divisible. And Spinoza argued that no, extension as such is not divisible. Yeah, so yes, he would say they're all simple in that sense of indivisible, right? Obviously, in some sense, Spinoza's God is not simple. There's lots of attributes and modes and whatever, right? Like, according to Maimonides, this is like infinitely idolatrous, basically, infinitely polytheistic. Right? I mean, like Maimonides is so strict that he says that, like, there are no true positive predications with respect to God, because that would imply that there's a distinction of subject and predicate in God. Yeah.
So if a monad expressed himself infinitely, I wonder why do we picture each monad as like a mini god of Spinoza? Why do they say that they're relaxed?
Well, because there's more than one. Like there can't be a mini god of Spinoza.
No, but once he removes the idea of singular substance being God, once God be true, it's created as eminent. Why do we hold them to be little attributes? Why couldn't they just be? Aren't they more similar to Spinoza's idea of God and then just like multiply?
Well, I mean, but they have this relation to each other, and they have this relation to God, right? So, I mean, yeah, that's, as I said, you can't have a mini God of Spinoza, right? A God of Spinoza has nothing external to it, so there can't be a mini one. Right? But you can, but Spinoza's attributes are in a certain way external to each other. They're completely different. Each one could be thought only through itself and not through the others. But as I said, even that isn't, I think that's the route to go if you wanted to say that they're really the same as each other, right? And then you would say that that thing about eminent being is really unnecessary. That's just another way of saying that the same simple divine power is the source of all, right? So, but as I said, the fact that some monads are possible but not actual, first of all, shows that they're different from God, because God is a necessary existence. And second of all, shows that there's a relationship between each one of them and God. There's two relationships between them and God. One is that every possible monad is something that God understands. That is, it's found in the divine intellect. I mean, I don't know exactly how Leibniz wants to understand the divine intellect. It's like, um, um, it's definitely intellect in an eminent sense. It's not the kind of intellect we have, which would not be suitable for God. But in any case, like in the divine intellect, there are eternal ideas of every possible monad. But there's also a special relationship between God and an actual monad. Namely, that God created. Right? And even if there was no creation in time, remember creation, like finite substances depend at every instance on like divine concurrence. Leibniz agrees with that. So they're always being created by God, so to speak. So that's this action. That's this action of an infinite cause on a monad. It's made possible by eminent being. And now you can see why eminent being has to be circus, because there has to be a distinction between God and the finite substance, such that God, the necessary existent, can like act to create or maintain in being the contingent existent, which is the finite substance. So in that way, the monads are completely different from Spinoza's attributes. And again, it's that same difference, right? There's like there's like three differences between Leibniz and three fundamental differences between Leibniz and Spinoza. It's hard to say which one comes first, but one is the distinction between God and finite substances, and another is the distinction between contingent and necessary, or between possible and actual. And one is eminent being, whether that makes sense or not. Those three things go together. And it's hard to say which one comes first, but there's like a tight connection between them. Okay, are there more questions about that before I go on? Okay. Doing not great, but not terrible. Okay, so the next thing to talk about is the internal structure of a monad. And that's the next thing Leibniz talks about too. So they don't have parts, but they do have an external structure, right? So that is the sense in which they're simple is they're not absolutely simple. They're certainly not simple in the way Maimonides' God is simple. But they don't have parts outside of parts. They don't have parts that can be taken apart from each other. So they actually have two kinds of non-part parts, right? One is what Leibniz calls here their passing states. These are discussed in sections 10 through 11. Monads are inextended in space, but they are extended in time. So, I mean, notice again that time is coming in here in a weird way, just as we saw in Descartes and Spinoza. And again, I won't say a lot about that, except that, it's good to notice that if you want to understand Kant's reaction to these people. So here's the monads, and again, like I like to draw them with the time direction and being up, and so these are their passing states. They succeed each other. Apparently, this is another weird thing. Apparently, Leibniz isn't worried about this continuum. I'm not sure why not. They don't think these passing states are supposed to be discrete blobs, the way I've drawn them, right? I mean, think the monad continuously develops in time from one state to another. But, okay, so they have these passing states. And the states are all different from each other, but they all have to follow each other from some internal principle. I mean, they have to follow each other from an internal principle because the monad can't be acted on by an external cause. Also kind of because of this. The whole infinitely complex truth about the monad follows from its own intrinsic unique quality. Right, and this is also why, as he says in section 22, in a certain way, each one of these states contains all the others. Since this is section 22, and since every present state of a simple substance is a natural consequence of its preceding state, the present is pregnant with the future. Right? Like, there's something in this previous state that accounts for everything about this state. So they have, as Hegel would say, the same context. Just the form has changed. So that's the temporal structure of the monad, but also each one of these passing states is not simple, not absolutely simple. It has an internal structure, and the internal structure is the structure of perception. So all of these, what are they perceptions of? Well, they're all perceptions of all the other monads. So every monad, there's two things about every monad that are not exactly the same, but that are like two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Every monad expresses the essence of God, and every monad represents all the other actual monads. That is, it represents infinitely many monads, and those are just the ones that are actual, because otherwise God would be the seer. So, in a way, each one of these states of every monad is the same as all the others, because they're all representations of or perceptions of the same objects. They differ from each other in clarity and distinctness. That is, in clarity and distinctness per monad, right? That is how clearly and distinctly it represents this one and this one and this one. And by the way, I hope this is clear. I'm drawing this direction is time. What is this direction? Nothing. There's no direction here, right? They're not. We haven't explained how space can come in here. Right? This could be like alphabetic order or something. Or like order from more perfect to less perfect. But there isn't one monad that's the most perfect. Because there's infinitely many of them, so they'll just get better and better. And it's actually Leibniz. So here's another important distinction that's not found in Descartes or Spinoza that Leibniz introduces. It's the distinction between perception and consciousness or apperception. This is also called. Um, in Spinoza, every idea was supposed to be the same as the idea of the idea. Right? So Spinoza proved that I can't have an idea without being conscious that I have it. In Leibniz, Leibniz says these are two different things. And that's why, as opposed to Descartes and Spinoza, Leibniz famously starts talking about unconscious thought. Right? Thoughts that I can have without being conscious that I'm having them. For Descartes and Spinoza and Locke, for that matter, that doesn't make any sense. But it also explains how this difference in clarity and distinctness is possible, because this mind here has the idea of this monad with all its infinite premises, right? Because it has a representation of all the past states of this monad going all the way back. But it's not conscious of all of them. In fact, it's conscious of very few of them. It's conscious of very few of them separately from each other. They all kind of add up into a confused perception. And when we bring in space, it's going to be the same. Like if I represent the whole universe, why can't I see what's behind that wall? And the answer is that it does have an effect on me. I do sense it, but it's at such a low level and so confused. It's part of a kind of background murmur, as Leibniz puts it, that I'm not conscious of that effect. At least not its effect on my visual organs. Of course, I can hear something that happens behind that wall, right? So there's something very complicated is going on, but that's supposed to be the principle behind all of it. Yeah.
It's not like why we know things exist outside of what we see in here.
Well, I mean, so how do we know anything exists except our own monad? And the answer is, again, that it's logically possible that I'm the only monad. Right? And by the way, if you want to know like what it's like for a monad to represent, I mean, I kind of imply this what I just said about behind the wall, whatever. You want to know what the world of monads looks like to a monad. You're a monad. This is what it looks like. Right. So, but how do I know that there's anything outside of me? Because, I have these states that represent these. So these things have objective reality in my states, as Descartes would put it, but how do I know they have formal reality? And the answer is, otherwise God would be a deceiver. So it's like logically possible that even just one monad could exist on its own without any of the others. But but that would be a less perfect world. And I mean, and you can see that principle of sufficient reason working, right? Why just this one? Why not just this one? Suppose these are both equally perfect. And Leibniz does think there can be two different things that are equally perfect. I think he bases an argument on that in the Theodicy. So there couldn't be any reason for creating one rather than the other. So even though it's logically possible for God to create one and not the other, it's that is, it doesn't violate the law of contradiction. It does violate the principle of sufficient reason. So God wouldn't do it. Right, so every monad, anyway, so that's what the states are like. They're kind of perceptions. Um, and, every monad is in that way like a mind. It has perception. And on the other hand, the like drive, that is the conatus, nisus, that leads the monad on from this state to the next one, is a kind of appetite. Right? So every monad has perception and appetition. And that's the way in which they're all like minds. And that's all it does, right? All it does is perceive, and based on what it perceives, desire, and therefore, because nothing can interfere with it, like obtain the next state. I mean, it doesn't obtain everything that it desires. That's why the next state leads on to another state and so forth. But as Leibniz puts it, it always obtains some of it. So, and yeah, as Leibniz says in section 17, furthermore, this is all one can find in the simple substance, that is, perceptions and their changes. So that's what they are. So what are bodies then? Why does it seem like they're bodies? Well, um, um, no monad has a perfectly clear and distinct perception of itself or any other monad, let alone of all the monads. And that's because it would have to have a clear and distinct perception of something infinite, something infinitely complicated. And a finite mind can't contain that. So, saying that I'm a little bit dissatisfied with that explanation. But I won't second guess myself too much right now. So, right, so it can't contain like an infinitely detailed representation of anything. I mean, that is, it does in a way contain an infinitely detailed representation of everything, but it can't consciously contain it. It can't clearly and distinctly contain it. So, so what any monad perceives is always confused representations of all the other monads. And because, as we'll see, there have to be an infinite number of monads, so to speak, in every direction. What the monad perceives is always an infinitely confused representation that is infinitely many monads confused together. So like that means that even though every monad is unique and different from all the others, no monad perceives all the differences between the other monads. On the contrary, there's always infinitely many differences that it doesn't perceive. And so this is why there seems to be something homogeneous in the world, namely body. Right? It seems to be something that, at least in some respect, doesn't change as you go from one part of it to another. Because again, when you go from one part to another, there always is a difference, but you don't ever perceive all those differences. So to you, it always seems like something remains